All right, welcome back, everybody. I couldn't be more excited to introduce our next guest. He did this as part 2. So if you missed part 1 yesterday, don't worry. We're actually going to rebroadcast part 1 at some other date in the future. So check out Step Beyond Green's website, or we'll also be sending that video over to the Grainsmith, and I'm sure they're going to post it on their line so you can see part 1 and part 2 together. But I tell you what, Patrick, people right now are waiting to see what we're going to do next. I get so many comments in the chat that's like, man, I can't wait till tomorrow. So I'm excited. I'm going to turn it over to you. Take it over, my friend.
Great. Thanks for having me again. Again, my name is Patrick Hill. I run a wood shop called the Grainsmith. Actually just started over in a new shop. The last shop I had actually was in a fire and lost some things, and now I'm restarting. And I'll give you a little bit of a peek at the shop and the progress where I'm at a little bit later, just so you can see what's kind of going on behind the scenes here. But last night I did get this finished being poured here. I didn't actually clean it up like I was thinking I might. I wanted you to see how messy it actually is. It's a little messier than I usually end up with. Lots of overpour. I tend to overpour rather than underpour. I can always remove it. The material is expensive to waste, but again, I'd rather have the bubbles a little proud of the surface and have any issues happening above the actual surface, so I can sand that off and get down to the base layer. I will take a second and just show you my process at removing some of this. I imagine the sander is going to be pretty loud and not so great on your guys' ears. So I probably won't sand this whole thing, but I will show you a little bit of my process at removing this material so we can get down to a flush piece here. I did also over here, I did set up a frame for this guy. Again, I poured this on 2 days ago, and then I just did that final little touch up yesterday. It was very quick that I did with you guys if you saw it yesterday, but just put a little layer over the top, and that takes care of any of those real tiny surface bubbles, and make sure again that this was the tape side, so this was what I had as the bottom. And I'll show you this piece over here. As you can see the bottom, you can see that there's like some tape marks. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but sometimes there's little folds in the tape so this piece, this little section here is going to be below the surface. So I will need to do another pour on this surface to get it flush. Now here's another big debate. These cracks here that did not have epoxy come through. Well, this is going to be the bottom. Is it truly necessary to fill these voids? Probably not. Many people would probably just use some wood putty or some kind of filler to fill those cracks, because again, it's on the bottom. What is the purpose of doing this epoxy? It's really so that we have a flush surface. If say this was your desk at home and came over and for some reason you're eating a bowl of cereal and some milk spills down in one of these cracks, how do you clean it out without damaging the wood and getting rid of any milk so it doesn't spoil and smell? So having every nook and cranny filled is my preference, and I tend to just go ahead and use epoxy top and bottom. It's just my personal preference. I'm a little particular sometimes, and that's just the way I do it. There are many ways of doing what we did yesterday and we'll do today. This is just how I do it. Not saying it's the best way. I have learned by making lots of mistakes, so I can definitely tell you a lot of things what not to do. But these are some things that that I know do work, and they work well for me. One of my, maybe strong or weak points, you could say, is not the best at following directions, my own directions even. So it was kind of funny. I was joking with the guys last night that, this turned out really quite nice. I should start following my directions more often. You know, it's there's a lot of variables with this stuff, and with the more experience you have, you can react to something just by seeing it and how it's happening. So there's a lot of different things and ways and forks in the road that could happen, that I could veer this way or that way when something's happening. Much like a cook, they might write a recipe book, but when they're in the kitchen, they're probably adding a dash of this, a dash of that, a little bit of that. That's my tendency of how I operate in the shop. But with epoxy in particular, you want to be very careful with your measurements. That's one you don't want to mess up. And I'll talk about that a little bit later with the eco epoxy that we'll use in this large void pour. I did pre-measure some stuff out. I messed it up pretty good my first time. This is actually only my second time using this eco epoxy. Eco epoxy is actually a plant-based resin, where most every other type that is out there is going to be a petroleum-based. So this is like a food safe. It's very eco-friendly, as the name suggests. So it's a new one to me. The first time I did it, I did something wrong. I don't know for sure. It might have been my mixture. It might have been the amount of time I mixed it for. So this time I'm going to I double checked my measurements, made sure they're accurate. I would have preferred to have graduated cylinders rather than these Home Depot measuring cups. I think this should hopefully do it, but ideally I would be using a nice tall graduated cylinder like you'd use in science class or whatever. Another way that I prefer to use and measure epoxy is with an actual weight scale. So if you measure it by weight and you're getting down to the gram or milligram, you're a lot more accurate. I haven't done the math on this one with the specific gravity and all that to figure out what the ratio would be by weight. And that will be my preferred technique in the future. But again, I haven't done that math, so we're going to follow the manufacturer's suggestions and do a 2-to-1 mix ratio on that. That is something that we kind of glossed over a bit yesterday when we were talking about all the different types of epoxy, what to use and when to use it and where. This is an epoxy that's going to be good for deep pours, meaning it's a very slow cure. So the heat that's happening in the curing of it happens over a longer period of time, so you don't have as much risk of thermal curing, which again is a bad thing. If you were to leave a mixture, say, if we were to even mix 2 pumps of the West system like we did yesterday, and we left it in that cup for more than 10-15 minutes, it may just automatically start heating up and get to a point where it's actually steaming and smoking and off-gassing, and in a matter of seconds it crystallizes and hardens, and it leaves blemishes within the epoxy. So it's definitely an undesirable thing, but it can happen. But again, we'll get a little bit more into the eco-epoxy later. I just wanted to touch up on this piece here and follow up with how this turned out. And again, I think it turned out pretty good. I will do a little bit of sanding on this. I won't waste too much time and sand it all flush, but I will touch on some of the sanding techniques. So my preferred method here is just to use this nice big beefy sander by Festool, a belt sander, a palm sander, that would all work. Some people will use like a hand plane, like a block plane or something to remove this material. I prefer not to use something like even a card scraper or something like that, even a razor blade, just scratch it off. If you use a block plane or a chisel or something that's a knife, it can chip it off and fractures it off, and can leave imperfect surfaces inside your crack. It can chip out in the crack actually, or the void. So I tend just to use sandpaper. I usually go with, I start with a 60 or 80. This here is a 120 that I have. I'm sorry, I should have had that ready. Give me 1 second. excuse me. So here I've got a 60 grit. It depends on where you're going. Sometimes it's easiest just to get it off with the lowest grit paper that you have. But this is already sanded to 120. If I can get the material off without scratching it too much, that's the goal. Another thing that I make sure of, at least with this, if your sander does have the option to have these different pads on it, some are thicker, thinner. This is the hardest and the thinnest. This is the next level up. There's even one level higher that I've got right over here. And so here you can see the 3 different thicknesses. The thicker it is, the more squishy it is. I don't know if you can see that, but this one's very rigid. So this will flow. If you use this, it's going to sand the side wood as it's sanding the top of the epoxy. You really just want to get the epoxy, so we're going to use the hardest pad that I've got. And I think I'm just going to focus on this crack on the end here, and we'll just get that one done quick. I hope it's not too noisy. Maybe we can turn the audio off here for a moment. Just hit that audio button. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to shut off the volume for maybe a minute, but I'll be right back after I finish this. All right, so as you can see, it kind of threw off all this white dust. It's just breaking off the epoxy in bigger chunks. That's what I want. If you start doing it too early, it's going to gum up and it's going to cause problems if it's not cured as well as it is here, which the fingernail test is what you usually do. Is you dig a fingernail into it, and if you can still dent it, you're still good to apply another layer. The epoxy will adhere to itself. If it's fully hardened, then you would want to sand it just about like it is here, so that it gives it a mechanical adhesion. You can see here there's one little micro bubble that came to the surface. I'm not even going to worry about that, because by the time I fix that and sand it again, there's going to be another micro bubble or something that opens up. So that's that really. This main surface in here, this will take a good 5-10 minutes to get cleaned up. With that sander, it really hogs off the material nicely. But one thing is, you saw me maybe digging in the corner of that sanding pad into it, trying just to get the epoxy without touching any of the wood around it. Be very careful when you're doing that. You don't end up sanding your spot and going below the rest of the wood. You want to make sure that when you run your hand over it, and you don't look at it, you don't even know it's there. That's the whole point, is that when this is all done, it's just flush with the surface and you can't even tell that there's something there. And by the time this is all finished and cleaned up, it should be pretty much see-through. Now this stuff, as you see, is, I relate it to like a plexiglass. Excuse me. I relate it to a plexiglass. If you scratch plexiglass, if you take a sandpaper to it, it instantly goes from perfectly clear to cloudy and you can't see through it. Same concept here. The way to get the plexiglass totally clear again is keep sanding it to a higher and to a higher and higher grit, and eventually it'll become clear again if you go high enough. The higher you go, the more clear it's going to be. I tend to find that about 500 grit is the top of really what you would need. And I'm, again, a bit of a perfectionist when it comes to some of these things, and get a little anal over trying to make it crystal clear again. I do want to mention one of the products I use to help me with that is these Abralon pads is what they're called. I get them on Amazon. They're by Merca, but Abralon, Abralon. If you go to Amazon and you type that in, it'll pull these pads up. I've got a 180, 360, 500, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. You know, the 4,000 is basically, it feels like a kitchen cloth basically, but it does have an abrasive in there. What these are made for is for polishing bowling balls. That's actually the industry they're designed for. But what they do work for in this application really well is polishing the epoxy. So this will sand the wood and the epoxy, and it has a nice cushioned back, a foam back to it, so that the corner, you don't have any edges of your sander digging in and leaving any gouges anywhere. So I tend to really like to finish with this. I generally will use the 180, the 360, and the 500, and that is another somewhat of an issue when you're sanding to 500 grit. What is the finish you're using? Most finishes recommend going really no higher than 220 so that the finish has something to grab onto and actually adhere to the surface. So you can, it's kind of a catch-22 or whatever, that it can cause more problems. So that's one of the complications with epoxy, is trying to get the epoxy clear and then the finish to soak well into the pores of the wood, but also have somewhat of a seamless transition from the epoxy to the wood. You don't want a much different sheen on the epoxy than you do on the wood itself, and many finishes just don't even adhere to epoxy because it has no pores and it's just solid. So that is one of the issues. One of the main finishes that I use is water locks. I'll go grab a can of it right here. It's again, water locks. It is their original, the sealer and finish. This is my can that I opened April 29th. But the reason it's all bent up here, that's another little quick tip on this stuff, is whenever you use any, squeeze the can so that all of the air is escaped before you put the plug back in. And this plug is actually the more important plug than the screw-on cap. But anyways, that's kind of another topic. But this finish does work really well in conjunction with both of them. I've used Odie's oil. Odie's oil, I don't know how to say it, but that's a really nice finish that works in combination with the two as well. Sometimes certain waxes as a top coat over your finish helps merge them all together and make it just look nice all together. Other than that, I think that's most of it as far as the finishing of this piece. I do want to leave a little bit of time to make sure that we get this stuff over here properly mixed up and pour that. And I do want to leave some time for questions and answers at the end, so that I can get a little more feedback of what you guys are actually curious about. And then there's a couple other things that I forgot to mention that I do want to mention that I forgot to mention yesterday that are kind of some big things. One thing that I may have glossed over as well is the level working surface. If I use this little workbench often for epoxy, just again, if I have any drips, I end up seeing a drip on the floor, or I can look underneath it and see what's actually happening on the bottom side. See if the tape is failing at all. But making sure that your surface is level, I've put shims under the legs whenever I do a pour and pull out the level and make sure that I'm on a nice level surface. Otherwise, you're just going to have something that's dripping right off the edge, or one side of a cavity is going to be a little bit low, even such as this here. I should have put a little more epoxy in this. I think it should be okay, but one side is a little bit lower and this side is totally good. I must not have had it perfectly level yesterday with the secondary pour. I actually did do 4 separate pours to finish this yesterday. So the first one I did with you guys at the live demo, and then after I did 3 more. And again, the whole purpose to not doing too much at once. You don't want it to thermal cure if you have too much volume with too little surface area. So if you, again, like I was saying, 2 pumps of the West systems of each part, if you have it in a small little cup, it's basically a cube, a cylinder of material, a lot of volume, very little surface area. If you were to take that same amount of epoxy and spread it out over a large flat surface, that it will do just fine. It's again about the more surface area, the easier it has time to cool off, and it doesn't have that thermal reaction, the negative thermal reaction. It is okay to sand if you have a problem with something on the surface. It is okay to sand it and then put more epoxy over it. Really, at any time, even later down the road. Again, with the thumbnail test right now, this is, I can barely leave a little bit of a dent. That's where I like to usually sand it. But you know, this I probably would sand before I applied more, just to make sure I've got a good mechanical adhesion as well as the chemical. But I think that's pretty much it for this oak piece. I will be finishing these pieces at some point, and obviously with this ash piece over here with the deep pour that we're going to do, you guys won't see the end of it. But I will make some posts about it on my Instagram account. So go ahead and follow me at the Grainsmith on Instagram, and keep an eye out in the next week or 2 for follow up on these pieces and how I finished it. And I'm always happy to talk wood. Feel free to comment on any of the pieces, and I'm always responsive if there's any questions, and I love to help out if you're trying to figure out how to do this. So don't hesitate to reach out to me. Instagram is a great way, or Facebook is another good way. And that's just the Grainsmith on Facebook. So again, that's enough for this for right now. We will be touching more on this later down the road. So we're going to put that off to the side, and we'll pull out this thing. So I have to admit that this is not my forte, but I've been wanting to play around with this Eco Epoxy. Again, I used it just recently for the first time ever, and I failed pretty miserably at it. Something was off. It didn't cure properly. After about 6 days, the consistency in the void was kind of like if you left a gummy worm out in the sun for a day. It was hard, but you could definitely stick a knife tip into it and gouge it very easily. So it wasn't acceptable. So I ended up having to chisel and dig and pull it all out and re-pour it, and trying to do that and still make the void look natural. So that is a big thing. That took me multiple days. And obviously when you're doing this as a profession and you have to take 2 days of lost time over a mistake like that, plus the cost of this epoxy, it's a little bit ridiculous. It comes in, it's a 2-to-1 mix ratio. So you have two of the part A, which is the resin, and you have 1 part of the hardener. So I've got 2 jugs just like this, and just this one. So there's 3 jugs in this one kit. These 3 jugs were $525. And so again, you don't want to waste it. You don't want to use it on something silly. I wasted it, and it was a lesson learned. So today we're going to try and teach you that lesson of making sure you mix it thoroughly. Follow the instructions on each manufacturer's labels. It's a huge thing. Each epoxy is different. Each manufacturer, even if it's the same material, they're going to have some slight difference in it that they want it mixed this way or at this slight different ratio. Again, that's one of the things that I like West Systems for so much. It's just one pump to one pump, and it's, you don't have to measure, you don't have to do anything, just pump it, and it's good to go. And that's another big benefit of why it's my go-to. The West Systems, just as a reference, these two parts, which add up to 5 liters, the epoxy cast adds up to 12 liters for $525. This one is 5 liters, and this costs about $200. I think it was like $220 with getting these. The pumps are additional. They do last multiple uses, but this last go around they were just a little bit too bad, so I just got a new set. But again, this stuff is not cheap, so that is one of the reasons why when you see a table, a river table is a really popular thing that people are doing these days. Just the cost of the epoxy alone going into that is a huge expense. So when you see tables listed for several $1,000s, that's a big part of why the epoxy alone in some of those tables can be multiple thousands of dollars. But anyways, yeah, that I did just want to touch on that. And again, each manufacturer will have instructions on the container. Go online, check out their website. They often have other tips and tricks on how to use their particular product. I'm going to go ahead and start mixing part A and part B. Again, I had them pre-mixed, so I didn't have to mess around with it too much while we were live here, to cap them off just to keep the dust out. I'm gonna mix them, and then I'll go through a little bit on how I built and what I did to make this framework here. I go ahead and put some gloves on and some eye protection just so you don't get any splashes. I do have good ventilation here. Make sure you're doing it in a well ventilated area. Measuring the amount of epoxy that is needed for this. You know, you can do the math on it and convert cubic inches to gallons or liters or whatever you want. I did not do any of that for this. That's again following my own instructions. I think this should be enough. I'm really hoping it is, and if anything, I'm hoping it's a little bit extra because I've got a couple little things I'm going to show you later what to do with maybe some of the leftover epoxy, because usually I end up mixing the epoxy and we'll have at least some leftovers, and I hate just throwing it away because it's so expensive, so I try to find something to do with it. I'm just making sure that I'm getting every last drop out of these containers, because again, the mix ratio does need to be very exact. Otherwise, you could have things that harden too fast and have a thermal reaction, or they could just never end up hardening at all. So this manufacturer says to stir it for 3 minutes. Phil, if you want to pull in here and try to see in the pail here, if you can see, it's a cloudy consistency right now. You can kind of see it almost looks like steam off of a street or a sidewalk going on inside. You want to mix this. Usually with most epoxies, it starts out like this. And then at a certain point of mixing, it will become clear. That's usually a good sign that you've mixed it well enough. I did that with the last one, and it may not have been enough because, again, there were certain parts of it that did harden, and the majority of it did not. So there could have been some parts that just weren't thoroughly mixed. So I'm going to definitely take my time on mixing this. This particular epoxy is It'll take about 3 days to fully cure. Pot life, I think, is several hours. 8 hours. Yeah, cure time is 72 hours, and the pot life is 8 hours, whereas with the West systems, it's 30 minutes. So this stuff, you've got plenty of time to work with. Some guys, if they're very concerned about bubbles, we'll mix this and then put the whole thing in a vacuum chamber, and that will pull out any of the micro bubbles and actually degas it completely. So if you've done your job and sealed all of the corners and edges of the wood with a previous layer, and then you go ahead and degas it, you can end up with a pretty flawless, almost invisible section of epoxy. I can still see in this, it has turned clear, but you can still see little wisps of, I don't know how to explain it, but it's you can see that there's a difference in the material in there. So you definitely want to scrape the sides really well, bottoms, all the corners, get everything really well mixed, so there's no part of this that is not thoroughly mixed together. But hopefully this is going to get there here real soon. Let me see a couple things that I didn't touch on yesterday. Tinting with color, that's a big one. There's lots of different colors out there to tint epoxy with. You know, the very popular metallic blue that goes in the middle of the river table. I haven't yet done one. It's just a little too popular in my mind right now, so I stay off the cuff a little bit, I guess. But that is a very popular color, is the turquoise or a metallic blue. I mix that into the resin prior to mixing the two parts together so that you can thoroughly mix and get any clumps. It's usually a powder, sometimes it's a liquid. What I've generally used is a powder. So I mix that in with one of the two parts, usually the resin side, not the hardener, and make sure that that's thoroughly mixed. And then when you mix the two, it's already mixed in, so that you don't have to spend too much time trying to make sure you've got any clumps or anything like that mixed in. This is getting pretty good. I'm going to stir it for a couple more seconds here and then set it off to the side and let some of those bubbles rise. Again, this, I've got plenty of time to let it sit, even in a large volume like this. It's not going to heat up. If this was West Systems and this volume and this container, we'd probably already be having issues with it thermal curing and heating up. I can feel the container, and it's actually still cool. That's definitely something. If you're holding a cup of epoxy and it starts warming up, start working on getting that spread out into your workpiece. If not, grab multiple cups and maybe disperse it into lesser volumes to help try to cool it off. But that when it starts heating up in your hand, that's a good sign that you've got a little too much volume. If it's a little bit warm, that's to be expected, but this is actually nice and cool yet. So that's one of the big benefits of these long cure, slow cure epoxies. Yeah, and you can also monitor the temp with, I don't have one handy right now, but a little thermal temperature gun. See, a lot of them are measuring people's foreheads to take the temperature these days. Similar thing, you can measure the temperature of certain things, and you can definitely measure the temperature of epoxy. If it starts getting too hot, you know you want to either pull some out. I mean, I've gone as far as taking a syringe before, and once I started realizing I'm warming up too much, I'll actually go in and suck some of that material out so that there's less in there. Usually doesn't, once it's kind of going wrong, it usually goes wrong. There's not a whole lot to save it when it is going wrong. Usually my tip would be, do not touch it once it's poured. That's another thing that I didn't really mention yesterday is I mean, you see how the amount of overpour I've got here on this oak piece. Instead of pouring more into each of these voids, I could have taken my popsicle stick and scraped up all of this extra stuff on the side and got that into the cracks. But what that does is it creates a lot of bubbles, little tiny micro bubbles, so it looks very, very cloudy. You often get, you know, some dust or some debris, and it just really can mess up the clarity and the quality of your pour. So I would say do not touch it. If you get some dust or a hair that settles in it, a dental pick or, you know, a toothpick is a very common thing, just to get in there and pull something out. If you are doing multiple pours, multiple layers, a good technique is to use a toothpick or a dental pick. When it has gotten gummy, if you've got any visible bubbles, you can pop those bubbles with a pick of some sort, and then that next layer will blend in seamlessly without having any of those bubbles in it. Another quick mention on that vein is if you had a bubble that you were not happy with here, you could take a little drill bit and by hand just drill it out, open it up, and pour some more into it. And it could, you know, be pretty seamless. You wouldn't be able to see it really that well at all. Looks like I'm running a little bit later, so I'm just going to give this one more quick stir. I'm going to pour this, actually, give me 1 second here. I want to show you what I've done. So this side rail, I just took a piece of hard maple that I scrapped that I had, cut it into 2-inch strips, and taped it, encapsulated it in Tyvek tape, and then I did the same with this section, taped them together, taped them onto this piece, so there is nothing in here. It's only wood and tape. Right here, I've got the sticky side up, so the tape is actually sticking to the bottom of the wood. There's lots of ways you could do this. Silicone is a very popular way. If you make a little bead of silicone along your edge, that helps keep the epoxy where you want it and not getting all over your piece. I'm a little worried about this edge here, and it potentially leaking out here. So I'll be watching this piece closely over the next couple days, but it stays liquid. Tomorrow I'll come back in here and it'll still be quite liquid. So it is something you really want to be careful of. Again, I know I'm running a little bit late here, so I want to quick, but not too quickly. Still seeing a couple swirl lines in there. Guess it's not all that exciting to see it pour, but it just is I literally just pour it in. I'm going to pour it in over here and let it work its way over to the other side. And I will mention that I do have this table shimmed up so that it is leaning slightly forward. So that actually reminds me I need to rotate this around. I want it leaning towards this front edge, not back. All right, so now it's going to be a little bit harder for you to see, but I have the table leaning forward so that the epoxy is going to stay this way and hopefully be a little bit thicker than the wood on that end. So it looks like I'm going to have plenty of epoxy here mixed up. And again, I do want to get this so that it is over the top of the surface, hopefully. I may have to come back and mix a little bit more later. I do want to save just a touch of this just to show you some of the things that I do with my leftovers really quick. I've got these silicone molds that are made for making ice cubes. So I throw something in it and I end up cutting it up and like slicing it sideways. So here I've got a little wasp nest that I found. So I'm just going to throw that and put that into some epoxy. And here I've also got just some shavings that I made with my my hand plane, just layered in there. So I'm going to fill these with epoxy and then I'll probably cut it and make, I don't know what it makes, but it's better than throwing away the wood chips and the leftover epoxy.
All right, well, Patrick, this has been super cool, man. I really wish we had some more time. Unfortunately, we got to move on. But I can't wait to see the result. So if you want to just make sure that we either get to your Instagram post or send us a link, we'll make sure that everybody who viewed today gets the option to see the final result. I know we're going to be itching to see it, so we'll look for that.
Fantastic. So, sorry for running a little bit late. I just wanted to try to get this in so that people could see one of these larger pours. But I appreciate you having me, and yeah, keep an eye out for it. It might take me a little bit. I've got a couple other projects I got to get back to, but these will get done in the next couple of weeks. So keep tuned.
All right. Thanks a lot, Patrick. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.